We're joined in studio by Abatya Leventhal. But first, let's speak with Professor Gerald Steinberg, the president of NGO Monitor, an emeritus professor of political studies at Bar-Ilan University. He speaks to us from Jerusalem. And Gerald, you didn't mince words in a piece in the Jerusalem Post today. The hatred, violence and anger out of control. The Israeli government has largely stopped functioning. But is there room here for compromise?
I think we're beginning to see elements of that. Certainly President Herzog's activities and the framework that he outlined a few weeks ago could be a basis for agreement. In fact, it's the only game in town, as I wrote. And there are a lot of actions taking place, not only the public ones, but also President Herzog talked about ones that are off the record, and we do see bits and pieces of that. So I think that the fact that we now have some members of the Likud on the record saying that they are in favor of a compromise and might not even vote if push comes to shove for this package of agreement on judicial reform unless there is an agreement. And they're members of the opposition who are working with them. So I think that we are going to see a compromise. The question is how much longer it's going to take and how much more damage is done. And then, of course, then the healing has to begin, which is going to be very complicated.
Speaking of damage, NGO Monitor, the organization who founded, deals with responding to human rights and other civil organizations abroad that you feel have painted an unfair picture of Israel. Since you deal with that question of Israel's image abroad, how much do you think it's been hurt by this issue over the last couple of months?
I think there's a lot of damage, and we hear it from people who are normally friends. We had the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, who's always been supportive of Israel, as he mentioned, being very critical about the process and about the judicial reforms. We've seen it from many different people and many different organizations in the United States and Europe and elsewhere. So I think that in many ways, the government, the promoters of the reform, didn't really anticipate. They didn't check to see how much the pushback would be and how it would affect Jewish communities. I think that's the main issue, is Jewish communities outside of Israel, the ones that are very much affiliated with and identify themselves with Israel, having a great deal of trouble defending this package. It was both, I think, poorly sold and presented, and the government really overstepped what could have been a possible set of reforms and change by going too far. And I think that's being recognized. A lot of the criticism is of the way in which this, what's supposed to be the override clause, that the Knesset can override any decision made by the High Court. That's something that is not consistent with what are generally considered to be liberal democratic values, democratic not in the sense of the political party in the United States, but also in the balance of power. So even though that is something that the proponents of the judicial reform say they have a means of dealing with it, they certainly didn't present it well. And as your introduction said, for 9 weeks, there have been very angry demonstrations increasing, and that makes it harder for those groups and individuals who are supportive of Israel to make that case in the current environment.
Gerald, stay with us. I just want to ask Batya, there's optimism about a compromise, and he mentions the fact that Likud members like Yuli Edelstein have expressed their concerns. But how far are they willing to go to potentially buck Prime Minister Netanyahu in almost maybe forcing a compromise?
Mind you, it's not just Yuli Edelstein. We also know that Danny Danon seems to position himself on the bipartisan spectrum here. And I think that Gerald had a very fair point in the sense that he hit the nail on the head there. The reality is that most Israelis will tell you and be in consensus and agreement that judicial reforms are needed. There is an issue with the judiciary in Israel. The way in which the coalition has gone about in terms of putting those reforms on the table has obviously caused quite a bit of sensitivities and anger on the other side of the spectrum that doesn't necessarily agree with them, that calls them a little too extremist. And so what we have now is, because we've got these two parts being the brass on the opposition and the coalition, we're talking about the main characters here. Because they are constantly logging heads with one another, we now have members a little bit behind the scene, not necessarily numbers 1 and 2 in certain parties, but a little bit more into those parties saying we need a bipartisan call here, we need to call for a compromise, and we are going to be on the level of the President Isaac Herzog. What we haven't seen yet is the heads of these parties doing so, and that's where the change will come in.
Well, I want to ask you, Gerald, certainly Yair Lapid could anger some of his base if he makes some compromises, but Prime Minister Netanyahu could risk breaking up his coalition, perhaps, if he would make these compromises. Do you think he's willing to go that far?
At this stage, no, we haven't seen any kind of change. And in fact, the short speech that he gave tonight didn't show any kind of real movement. He talked for national unity, but didn't change any of the policies, didn't say, okay, I've heard the message. I'm now going to stop the process of the legislation passing, or I'm going to introduce fundamental changes. I'm going to go sit down and join the talks at President Herzog's residence in terms of looking for a compromise. He hasn't reached that stage. But if we have 4 or 5 members of Likud, Yuli Edelstein, Danny Danon, Nir Barkat has been mentioned as someone who's also not happy with the divisions in the country and the costs that it's economic costs, but there's also security costs that are ongoing, and we can see that by the issues, the statements that are made by people in the reserves. If those could bring in other members of the Likud. If 4 or 5 members of Likud, and if they're joined by 4 or 5 members of the opposition, not just Lapid, I think Benny Gantz has actually shown more flexibility, more hard line.
We'll have to wrap it there, Professor Gerald Steinberg.